In a small town in the United States, where life seemed to move at a slow and steady pace, there lived a couple who were an example of happiness and stability. They were Laura and Michael Johnson, a couple who, in the eyes of the community, had a solid and fulfilling relationship. Laura, 35 years old, was a woman with a sweet and simple appearance, always willing to help others and known for her religious devotion. Michael, on the other hand, was a hard-working and dedicated man, always supporting his wife in all her decisions and commitments. The people of the town considered them an exemplary couple, and rarely was any rumor heard that could tarnish their reputation. Laura and Michael had been married for more than a decade, and although they did not have children, their home was a reflection of their love and commitment. For Michael, there was nothing more important than his wife's happiness. She was his reason for being, and he felt lucky to share his life with someone so kind and caring. Laura, on the other hand, felt that her life was almost perfect. She loved Michael and enjoyed the quiet life they led in that village, far from the hustle and bustle of the big cities. Their routine was simple, and although there were no luxuries or big events in their lives, they felt fulfilled with what they had. One of the most important aspects of Laura's life was her faith. From a very young age, she had been a deeply religious woman, and the local church was a place that held a special place in her heart. The parish of St. Jude, located in the center of the village, was her refuge, a place where she could find peace and comfort in her moments of anguish. Laura attended Mass every Sunday and, in addition, had the habit of going to confession frequently. For her, confession was a way of freeing herself from any burden or doubt she might have in her heart. Her devotion was so evident that many in the village saw her as an example to follow in terms of faith and spiritual commitment. Life in the village was quiet, almost monotonous. The streets were lined with small houses, with well-kept gardens and porches where families would gather to chat in the evening. Everyone knew each other, and no secrets could remain hidden for long. In this atmosphere of familiarity and trust, Laura and Michael moved naturally, greeting their neighbors and participating in community activities. Laura was particularly active in church meetings, where she helped with charitable missions and in organizing religious events. The parish priest, Father Andrew, was a man in his 40s, with an imposing presence and a voice that conveyed authority and serenity. He had arrived in the town about 5 years ago, and since then he had earned the respect and admiration of the community. His way of speaking and his commitment to the church had made him an important figure for the faithful, and Laura, in particular, felt great admiration for him. Although they had never shared a personal conversation beyond confession, Laura saw Father Andrew as a spiritual guide, someone she could fully trust. Every week, Laura went to the parish to confess her sins and seek Father Andrew's advice. It was a practice that helped her maintain her faith and feel at peace with herself. During those confessions, Laura spoke of her worries, her fears, and any small slip-ups she might have made. Father Andrew listened patiently, giving her words of encouragement and reminding her that there was always a path to forgiveness and redemption. For Laura, those words were a balm for her soul, and each time she emerged from confession, she felt that she could face any challenge with God's help. As time went on, the relationship between Laura and Father Andrew grew closer and closer. Although they always met in the context of confession, Laura began to feel that she could open up to him in a way that she could not do with anyone else, not even her husband. Father Andrew, for his part, also seemed to show a particular interest in Laura, although always within the limits of his role as a priest. For him, Laura was an exemplary parishioner, a woman of faith who constantly sought God's guidance and who lived according to the principles of the church. Michael, oblivious to what was going on in his wife's heart, went about his daily life, confident in the stability of their marriage. He did not share Laura's religious fervor, but he respected her beliefs and supported her in all her church activities. To him, Laura's devotion was just another sign of her goodness and dedication. He had never had any reason to distrust her, and his love was so deep that he could not imagine a world in which Laura was not completely honest with him. However, as the weeks passed, Laura began to experience a mix of emotions that she could not explain. Every time she went to confession, she felt something inside her change. She was no longer just seeking spiritual peace. There was something else that drew her to the church and to Father Andrew. She could not understand what was happening, but a part of her began to feel nervous and anxious every time the time for confession approached. It was a feeling that confused her, but at the same time produced a kind of excitement that she had not felt in a long time. Despite these feelings, Laura tried to remain faithful to her beliefs and to her husband. She knew that marriage was sacred and that any thought or desire that would take her away from Michael was something she had to eliminate from her heart. However, The attraction she was beginning to feel for Father Andrew was something she could not ignore. As the days passed, this attraction became a kind of obsession, a hidden desire that tormented her and made her feel guilty every time she looked into Michael's eyes. Father Andrew, although aware of Laura's devotion, did not seem to perceive the internal conflict she was experiencing. For him, Laura was just another woman among his parishioners, someone he had to guide on her spiritual path. However, the frequency with which she went to confession and the type of topics she began to address in their conversations began to attract his attention. Laura talked more and more about her personal life, about the doubts and fears she had in her marriage, and Father Andrew, although respectful of her position, could not help but feel a strange connection with her. As their relationship grew closer, Laura and Father Andrew began to spend more time together outside the confessional. It was always in the church, where no one could see them, and although they both tried to maintain composure and respect for their roles, the tension between them became more and more evident. They both knew that this was wrong, that their thoughts and desires were a sin, but the attraction they felt for each other was something they could not avoid. The church, which had always been a sacred and peaceful place for Laura, became a space of conflict and temptation. Every time she entered, she felt the weight of her own thoughts and desires, and although she tried to fight them, she realized that she was falling into a trap from which it was impossible to escape. The people, oblivious to what was happening inside the church, continued their quiet, uneventful lives. No one suspected that behind the facade of devotion and respect, Laura and Father Andrew were beginning to cross a line that would endanger not only their own lives, but also the peace and harmony of the entire community. Laura's confessions to Father Andrew became more and more frequent, to the point where it was no longer an occasional activity, but almost a daily habit. Every time she passed by the church, Laura felt an inexplicable attraction to the place, as if something was calling her to enter. She knew that this was not right, that her devotion should not be focused on one person, but on God, but the magnetism she felt towards Father Andrew overwhelmed her. The boundaries between the sacred and the profane began to blur, and each confession was a moment of tension and contained emotion. At first, Laura tried to keep the conversation strictly within what she considered appropriate. She told Father Andrew about her doubts, about the fears and insecurities she sometimes felt in her marriage, trying to find in him a spiritual guide. But little by little, those encounters took on a different tone. They began to look at each other in a way that they both knew was forbidden, a way that did not correspond to the relationship between a priest and a parishioner. The spark between them was increasingly evident, and although they tried to ignore it, that forbidden attraction grew with each passing day. Father Andrew, although faithful to his vows, was human, and his desire for Laura overwhelmed him. On more than one occasion, he tried to gently reject her, advising her that perhaps she should find another priest to confess to in order to avoid her feelings clouding her judgment. But Laura persisted, and with each encounter, Father Andrew felt her will weaken. The tension became so palpable that they could no longer hide it. What had started as a repressed attraction soon grew into something stronger, into a passion that neither of them could control. Finally, one day, the barrier between them was broken. Laura, after a long confession in which she had shared all her repressed fears and desires, could no longer contain herself and approached Father Andrew, looking at him with an intensity that he could not resist. In a moment of vulnerability, they both let themselves go and ended up giving themselves over to that forbidden passion that they had tried to ignore for so long. The church, which had been the symbol of their faith and devotion, became the scene of a clandestine love that they both knew was wrong, but which they could not stop. From that first meeting, Laura and Father Andrew began to meet in the church secretly, taking advantage of the moments when the place was deserted or when the town was plunged into the stillness of the night. At first, the meetings were sporadic, but the attraction between them quickly grew and they became more frequent. They met up to 3 times a day, and each encounter was more passionate and desperate than the last. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but the intensity of their feelings made it impossible for them to stop. The church, which had been Laura's spiritual refuge, became the place where her darkest desires materialized. Every corner became a witness to their secret encounters, and the guilt they both felt after each encounter became heavier, although never enough to stop them. The passion they shared was a secret that consumed them, and they both knew that, at any moment, they could be discovered, but the risk only made their encounters even more intense. As the days passed, Laura began to experience a mix of emotions that confused her deeply. On the one hand, she felt devastating guilt for cheating on her husband, a man she had sworn to love and respect. Michael was good, loving, and had always been by her side, supporting her in everything she needed. But on the other hand, Father Andrew had awakened in her a passion and desire she had never experienced before. She knew that what she was doing was wrong, that she was betraying not only her husband but also her faith, but the love and attraction she felt for the priest was too intense to resist. Father Andrew was also torn between guilt and desire. Every time he saw Laura, he felt like he was breaking his vows, that he was failing God and his community. But at the same time, the attraction he felt for her was something he couldn't ignore. He had tried to get away, even considering asking for a transfer to avoid temptation, but every time he thought about leaving town, the desire to see her and be close to her stopped him. He knew he was risking everything, but in his mind, that passion was something so deep and true that he couldn't give it up. Meanwhile, Michael, oblivious to what was happening, began to notice changes in his wife's behavior. Laura, who was usually loving and attentive, had become distant and reserved. She spent a lot of time away from home, and when she returned, she seemed to be lost in her thoughts, almost as if her mind was somewhere else. At first, Michael didn't think much of it. He thought that perhaps Laura was going through a difficult time, or that her church activities were keeping her busier than usual. But over time, he began to suspect that something else was going on. Every time he tried to talk to Laura about her behavior, she would respond evasively, assuring him that she was just tired and needed time to reflect. Michael, although concerned, tried to trust his wife. He knew how important the church was to her, and he thought that her estrangement might be due to a spiritual crisis. However, as Laura continued her increasingly frequent outings to church and visits with Father Andrew, Michael began to feel an uneasiness that he could not ignore. One day, while he was in the center of town, Michael heard some people commenting on Laura's devotion and how much she was going to church lately. Some neighbors even mentioned jokingly that it seemed like Laura had made the church her second home. Although the comments were mostly harmless, Michael could not help but feel a growing unease. He knew something was up, but he couldn't figure out what was really going on. Determined to clear his doubts, Michael began to pay more attention to his wife's movements. He began to notice the patterns in her outings, how she spent hours at the church, sometimes for no apparent reason. The restlessness he felt turned into a kind of obsession, and in his mind, the idea that Laura was hiding something from him began to emerge. Although he tried to convince himself that it was just a crisis of faith, he couldn't ignore the signs in front of him. Finally, one day, he decided to discreetly follow Laura when she left home to go to church. With his heart beating fast and a mixture of fear and desperation inside him, Michael hid near the entrance of the church, watching his wife's every move. What he saw that night left him in shock. When he peeked inside the church, he discovered something he would never have imagined, something that filled him with anger and sadness so deep that he couldn't even understand. There, in the sacred place where he had so often accompanied his wife to Mass, he saw her in the arms of Father Andrew, giving herself to him without restraint. The pain he felt was indescribable. Laura, the woman he had shared his life with and whom he loved deeply, was betraying him in the least expected place. His mind could not process the magnitude of what he was seeing, and the feeling of humiliation and shame that overwhelmed him was so great that, in an instant, his entire life seemed to fall apart. Michael left the church before Laura and Father Andrew saw him, but in his mind, the image of his wife and the priest together was etched like an open wound. Over the next few days, he tried to confront Laura, but the pain and rage he felt prevented him from acting clearly. His world had been destroyed, and every time he thought about what he had discovered, a deep, dark anger began to take hold of him. An anger that, in his troubled mind, could only be resolved in one way. After discovering Laura's betrayal, Michael's life spiraled into darkness and pain. That image of his wife and the priest together in the church tormented him day and night, robbing him of sleep and filling him with a rage he couldn't control. He had tried to find an explanation, to think of some reason to justify what he had seen, but each attempt only increased his rage and sense of humiliation. Michael, a man who had always believed in goodness and trust in others, felt betrayed and lost, as if his entire world had collapsed. Laura, for her part, was unaware that Michael knew the truth. She continued with her daily routine, secretly meeting Father Andrew at church, unaware that her husband had discovered their relationship. During their meetings, Laura and the priest continued to be carried away by the passion that united them, without thinking about the consequences or the damage that their forbidden love could cause. Despite the guilt they both felt, the desire to be together was stronger than any remorse, and with each meeting, their bond grew more intense and, at the same time, more dangerous. As the days passed, Michael's attitude became more and more disturbing. His behavior changed drastically. He stopped talking to Laura and avoided looking her in the eyes. There was something in his gaze, a coldness and a distance that Laura noticed, but could not understand. Sometimes she tried to talk to him, to ask if something was bothering him or if there was a problem. But Michael would only respond in monosyllables or change the subject, as if he were trapped in his own thoughts. Over time, Laura began to feel a fear she had never experienced before. Although she did not know exactly what was happening, she sensed that something had changed in her husband and that the tense calm in their home was not normal. However, fear was not enough to keep her away from Andrew. Her love for the priest and the passion she felt for him blinded her, preventing her from seeing the gravity of the situation she found herself in. One night, Michael, unable to bear the pain and rage that consumed him any longer, decided to confront his wife. He had spent days struggling between hate and love, between despair and sadness, but that night, something inside him finally snapped. Without warning, he approached Laura, who was in the kitchen, and asked her directly about her relationship with the priest. The question took Laura by surprise. At first she tried to deny it, but when she saw Michael's look, a mixture of fury and desolation, she knew there was no way to hide the truth. The tension in the room was palpable, and while Laura tried to find the right words, Michael looked at her with an intensity that made her tremble. She knew that what she had done was wrong, that she had betrayed her husband and that, no matter how many excuses she looked for, nothing could justify her behavior. In an attempt to calm him down, Laura tried to explain to him what had happened, how her attraction to Father Andrew had become uncontrollable and how, despite her feelings for Michael, she had fallen into temptation. But every word that came out of her mouth only seemed to fuel Michael's anger, who could not understand how the woman he had loved and trusted for so many years was capable of betraying him in such a way. The argument quickly escalated, and in a moment of desperation, Michael lost control. The fury he had contained for so many days exploded, and without thinking, he unleashed his anger on Laura. All the pain, betrayal, and humiliation he felt concentrated in a single impulse, and in that instant, his life changed forever. When he regained his composure, he realized what he had done. Laura was lying on the floor, motionless, with the expression of surprise and pain still on her face. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Michael, trembling, knelt beside his wife, unable to believe what he had done. His love, his partner, the woman he had shared his life with, was now dead because of his rage and despair. The weight of his actions fell upon him like a stone, leaving him powerless and paralyzed with guilt. He did not know what to do, or who to turn to. He could only stare at Laura's body, feeling as if his own life had fallen apart in that instant. The neighbors, alerted by the screams and the noise, were quick to call the police. Soon, the authorities arrived at the Johnson home and, seeing the scene, arrested Michael immediately. He did not resist. He was too shaken to resist, and in his mind, he knew that he deserved any punishment for what he had done. News of what had happened spread quickly through the town, and within hours, everyone knew of the tragedy that had destroyed the Johnsons' lives and left an indelible mark on the community. During the trial, Laura's relationship with Father Andrew came to light. Evidence of their affair and witness statements confirmed the infidelity, and this served as a mitigating factor in Michael's sentence. However, the pain of losing his wife and the guilt that consumed him were a punishment far worse than any sentence he could receive. Michael was sentenced to several years in prison, but in his mind, the real punishment was knowing that he had destroyed his life and Laura's in a moment of anger and despair. Father Andrew, after his relationship with Laura became known, decided to leave the priesthood and the town. The shame and remorse he felt were too great to continue with his life as if nothing had happened. He knew he had failed his faith, his community, and above all, he had contributed to a tragedy that he could never erase from his memory. She left the town in silence, carrying with her the weight of her guilt and the certainty that her forbidden love had been the origin of a chain of devastating events. The parish of St. Jude, which had been a symbol of faith and devotion for the community, was marked by tragedy. Parishioners, upon learning the story, began to avoid the place, and over time, the church was abandoned. No one wanted to remember what had happened, and for the town, the story of Laura, Michael, and Father Andrew became a dark secret that they preferred to forget.